good evening. I was told I ought to establish the relevance of what I'm going to talk about tonight first. So I'm going to mention that there's been a campaign on in Chester and in Liverpool for the last 2 weeks. I've been down there a few times. Of the people talking to me there, I should think it's about 20 people talked to me about it, and each of them had a very similar question where they were talking about the text of the Bible. Is it reliable? They believed it wasn't because they'd read books or heard on the media or read it in the Da Vinci Code or something like that, or seen it on the film on the television or on the cinema, that they didn't believe in the text of the Old Testament, text of the Bible at all. Now, mostly they were talking about the New Testament. They were talking about the text of the New Testament and the canon of the New Testament. But there were some of them that were talking about the Old Testament and were telling me that the Dead Sea Scrolls insist that the text of the Old Testament has been changing, and certainly if you get a scholarly book on the subject, they will make that claim. I'm going to try and show that that's unwarranted, but nonetheless that's what is going round in the people in the world in which we live, and we're going to have to defend our position on the Bible in a way that we didn't before, because the text of the Old Testament particularly has generally been considered to be reliable until very recently. The difference between Old Testament manuscripts in Hebrew, well, they're vanishingly small. Occasionally someone will find one letter difference in a misspelling between one manuscript and another out of the hundreds and hundreds of synagogue scrolls there are around. Critics have been attacking that lately and claiming that there's been a change in the text, development of the text of the Old Testament. I suppose it goes back to the old critics who were talking about this in the anything running right back to about 1850, but really their heyday ended in the 1970s when the archaeologists of the 20th century more or less disproved everything that the critics of the 19th century had said. Anyway, this paper is there to examine the evidence for the accuracy of the test of the Old Testament. That's what it's about. Let's start off by looking at the history of the Old Testament text. That the Law of Moses would have been written about 1400 BC, shortly after the Exodus. I suppose Job may be older than that, but nonetheless, we've got that's the start of the Old Testament, really, apart from possibly Job. The rest of the Old Testament is written over a span of about 1,000 years, ends with Malachi and Nehemiah a trifle before 400 BC. And the text of the Old Testament was then copied by scribes. The original autographed copies of the books aren't available to us. All we have is copies, and maybe even copies of copies, and copies of copies of copies, and so on. Now, to think the way that the text's been transmitted from to the present day, we first need to think about the early preservation of the Old Testament text. Now, the law, which I think originally consisted of the first 4 books of the Bible, I think the book of Deuteronomy is a later addition to it. It's a later addition, pretty well bang on the time that Moses died. It's not a very much later addition. But I think when it's talking about the first 4 books of the Bible, it is referred of, it was written by Moses and his scribes in the Sinai desert shortly after the Exodus. It's another 40 years before the book of Deuteronomy is written. And it's referred to in Deuteronomy 31. We read it in the reading, but I'd like you to turn it up. Look in Deuteronomy chapter 31 and verse 9. And it says that Moses wrote this law and delivered it unto the priests, the sons of Levi, which bear the ark of the covenant of the Lord, and unto all the elders of Israel. And I think that's telling us that Moses produced, either he wrote them himself, maybe he wrote the first one himself and his scribes copied it, and they were 13 copies. One of them was given to the Levites, the others were given to the princes of the tribes of Israel. 1 copy each, apparently. And if we go on, still in Deuteronomy 31 to verse 24, it says, It came to pass when Moses made an end of writing the words of this law in a book, until they were finished, that Moses commanded the Levites, which bear the ark of the covenant of the Lord, saying, take this book of the law and put it in the side of the ark of the covenant of the Lord your God, that it may be there for a witness against thee. It's interesting he puts it in the side, not in the inside, it's on the side of it, so they could read it without having to open the ark to do that. And in fact, we just read, or in the reading in verse 10, that they, at the end of every 7 years, in the solemnity of the year release, the Feast of Tabernacles, when all Israel has come to appear before the Lord thy God in the place which he shall choose, thou shalt read this law before all Israel in their hearing. And it seems to be referring to the Levites' copy of the law, which would be an old book, of course, by the time the exile happened. But nonetheless, every 7 years it had to be read. What seems to have happened then is that the law was placed, it's placed along with the Ark of the Covenant, and it's kept in the tabernacle, and in the course of time it will be transferred to the temple, and it's there that it remained as a standard text, and there's a reference to it in 2 Kings 22. And keep your finger in Deuteronomy because we're coming back. 2 Kings 22 and verse 8, which is the reign of Josiah. It says, Hilkiah the high priest said to Shaphan the scribe, I have found the book of the law in the house of the Lord. And Hilkiah gave the book to Shaphan, and he read it. So the book of the law was still there. Moses had it put there. There it was in 2 Kings. Now, that temple copy of the law, the tabernacle copy earlier on, was used as a standard from which other copies were made. Deuteronomy 17, this time, and verse 18. It's talking about the king. It's the law of the king. Deuteronomy 17, verse 18. It shall be when he sitteth upon the throne of his kingdom, that he shall write him a copy of this law in a book out of that which is before the priests, the Levites. So the king had access to the temple scroll, and he was to make a copy of it. So his copy would be an accurate copy, possibly not as accurate as one made by a trained scribe, but nonetheless it wouldn't be at the end of a long chain of transmission. It would be a copy made from the standard copy. It would be a first-hand copy of the law. Now, the book of Deuteronomy would have been added, of course, to the first 4 books of the Old Testament almost straight away, and other books would be added as they were written. And so we get the thing in the tabernacle, and the end of Judges when David then David dies and the temple is built by Solomon. It will be transferred to the temple. But then you get the Babylonian destruction. The temple was destroyed in the Babylonian conquest, and you'd expect the standard copy of the law to have been burned with the temple, and Jewish tradition asserts that that was the case. But when the Jews returned from captivity, they created a new standard from the best copies available, and according to Jewish tradition, and I have no reason to doubt this, there was a small number of first generation copies that had been made directly from the temple scroll and had somehow been taken into Babylon, and these were compared with one another. Only a handful of variants was found, and these were decided on a majority basis, and they were fairly minor. There's a supposed list of which ones they were. I don't know how accurately you can take that tradition. It's 400 or so years later, 500 years later, that the tradition comes from. So it could be wrong. But nonetheless, it's a general idea of what must have happened. There's a new standard now which was placed in the temple, and then we're on slightly solider ground now as to exactly what happened with it in terms of tradition, because this is back to almost living memory from when the Talmud was written down. So we know what happened. What happened was that there's a new standard text again in the temple, and copies for synagogue worship and scholarly study were made from that as required. And the process now was like that. There was a main copy in the temple, which contained the sort of first generation text. Moses wrote the law. The text we've got actually is one removed from it because its copy is made from the original. So we've got a copy made from the original and compared versions in the temple. That was used to make standard copies, which were then used to make copies that went out to synagogues and such like things. So they were only 5 away from Moses still, and made with great care. So we've got the sort of 5th generation copies available to everyone. 4th generation, a small number of them. 1 3rd generation in the temple. Well, in 70 AD the temple was destroyed again, and this time by the Romans. The 1st generation scroll would then be destroyed in that catastrophe, so would all the 2nd generation scrolls in the temple, and the text was reconstructed yet again by Jewish scholars, this time using available scrolls of good quality. So we're talking 5th maybe generation, maybe 6th generation, being put together to make another text of the Old Testament. It used to be thought these would all be synagogue scrolls, but among the Dead Sea Scrolls is a thing called a copper scroll, which tells us that many of the temple treasures were hidden away before the Romans turned up, and no doubt they would put some of the scrolls of the Old Testament among those. It would be unthinkable that they would think that was less valuable than the gold in the temple, which they definitely did hide, so that the scrolls would be hidden, I think, as well. So we'd be having 4th generation and 5th generation scrolls available to them. And the new standard text was produced quite rapidly. The evidence of both rabbinic literature and manuscripts from Nahal Haver is that the standard text was available by the end of the 1st century AD, and very possibly early. We actually have scrolls from about 100 AD which are exactly the same as the modern Hebrew text of the Old Testament. So we're fairly keen on what's happening. Now, they couldn't put the new text in the temple anymore because there wasn't one. So what they did instead was to make lots of copies of it and put them in all sorts of scholarly centres all over the world. And to do that, they had to ensure that there was a very accurate way of copying the text. And so they produced a method. First of all, you had, for licensed manuscripts, you required a well-trained scribe, first of all. And they had a set of very stringent rules. You had to sit in uniform, you had to copy from a certified exemplar copy, an initial copy. The copy was made letter by letter. He wasn't allowed to make a whole word at a time, or certainly wasn't allowed to do it sentence by sentence or take dictation. He had to look at a letter and copy that letter, look at the next letter and copy that letter. And what was produced is called a Masoretic text. Masoretic means, a masorate means a transmitter, someone who transmits the text on. And the text is known as the Masoretic text, and it's the basis of pretty well all modern Old Testament texts. When the manuscript was completed, it had to go undergo a series of tests to assure its accuracy. F.F. Bruce has a nice description. He says that there's no test, no matter how cumbersome or difficult, that they didn't do. They counted the number of each letter, they counted the total number of letters, they counted the middle letter, they worked out the middle word for each book, for each section of each book. And if any of them was wrong, they'd check it. If it was still wrong, they would take out the sheet of the scroll that they were working on, and that would be destroyed, and they'd start that sheet again. And there were no erasures. And only if all the texts were passed was the copy allowed for use. And they also produced the vowel sounds, but they didn't want to change the consonants. Everything was written only in a text, only had consonants in. But people were forgetting how to speak Hebrew, so they didn't want to lose that. They thought they'd put vowels in, but they didn't want to change the consonantal text, so the vowels are little dots which come above and below the line and occasionally in the middle of the letters. There's Hebrew text. This is from about 950 AD. This is the Leningrad Codex, and you can see the letters. There they are, right along. You can see these little dots above and below the line. That's an A. That's a sh. That's an E there, and so on. That's another A. And they've written them sort of because they didn't want to disturb the letters. They just put these dots around them. The letters stay as they were. In the margin, you'll find notes here. This is the Masorah. These are notes about copying, saying, look out here, there's a misspelling. This is a genuine misspelling. It's not a misspelling because the scribe got it wrong. That's more or less what it's saying. And things like that. So if there was, someone decided there was a mistake in the manuscript, they would make a note in the margin about it. They didn't change the manuscript. And as a result, the Masoretic text is absolutely wildly successful because all the Hebrew scrolls are exactly the same as each other. Sometimes you find this bit in between is different. Occasionally errors in that bit, but the actual biblical text is exactly the same. And they carried on for about 1,000 years. That's another one. That is the Aleppo Codex. This is possibly the oldest official manuscript, Hebrew manuscript around, if you discount the Dead Sea Scrolls. They worked for about 1,000 years. They gradually improved their methods. They were very, very successful. This is considered to be the best manuscript. The Leningrad manuscript, the one you saw before, is about the same age. They think the Leningrad manuscript is actually copied from this manuscript. It was unfortunately seriously damaged in 1947. An Arab mob burned down the synagogue in Aleppo in Syria where it was housed and tried to destroy it. They failed. It disappeared, went off with some Jewish character from the synagogue, rescued it, but he was killed and he'd hidden it and no one knew where it was. But they found it again. It's missing some pages, unfortunately, from the beginning. And there's an edition of the Hebrew Bible being produced in Jerusalem based entirely on it. I don't know how you can tell because it's exactly the same as all the other ones. But presumably the Masorah, they've got the bits around the edge in and you can tell from that. Anyway, the critics have countered the obvious facts of the Masoretic text by claiming that the reconstructed text that started the Masoretic process wasn't the best text, or even by denying that an original text ever existed, which is quite interesting. I talked to one from Manchester University not too long ago when they had the Dead Sea Scrolls exhibition on in the University Museum, and he was saying, oh no, well, there wasn't ever actually an original text. The scribes took Jewish stories and then different ones took different sets and they gradually modified it as they went along. I'll show that's wrong in a moment. But if we want to look and see what the evidence for an accurate text is, then we need to look at other witnesses as well to the text of the Old Testament. And there are quite a few of them. It's typical for us to think, well, there's just the Hebrew text, but there isn't. It isn't so. There are quite a lot. There's the Masoretic text, which starts about 100 AD. We have manuscripts of it before 100 AD, but it only really seriously had that copying behind it from that period onwards, and the text gradually improved. The Samaritans broke away from the Jews. The Samaritans were settled in Israel as early as 700 BC, time of Hezekiah, and they were taught the law of the land. They got some priests to go and teach them the law of, considered to be the law of the land. It was the law of God, of course, which was there. And they kept independent copies. Now, the Samaritan Pentateuch we've got shows signs of having been modernized. The language isn't quite the same as the Masoretic text, which preserves very archaic forms. The Samaritan one shows signs where they've changed the spelling a bit sometimes to bring it up to date, a bit like a sort of New International version of it, or Excel, perhaps a revised authorized version rather more. It's not very much different, but there are small differences. So maybe 400 BC rather than 700 BC. But of course the Samaritans and the Jews didn't really get on very well together, so there's no possibility that the Samaritans would use a contemporary Hebrew text taken by Jews to amend their own manuscript. They would be very keen on any difference was their difference, and they were not going to hang on to it. So there are minor differences, very small ones, but we have it as a witness, and it's an independent witness. Now we also have, as the Samaritan Pentateuch, they still have them around. There's several of them. That one's being used on Mount Gerizim at the Feast of the Passover, and they pick it up and wave it, and someone's taken a photograph and posted it on the internet. So that's what it looks like. The other problem with the Samaritan Pentateuch, of course, is that it is only a Pentateuch. There's no prophets or writings. It's just the first 5 books of the Bible. Now, it also contains odd places where it's been altered. For example, there's a commandment, there's the 10 Commandments, but the last one says, and make a temple on Mount Gerizim, which isn't in any other text except for just that one. Suggests that they've possibly altered it slightly. Now, you also get translations into foreign languages, and the earliest of those is the Targum, or the Targums. There are various ones. Targum is a method. These are loose translations into Aramaic for those brought up in Babylon who had difficulty with Hebrew. And there's a reference to this in Nehemiah. Nehemiah chapter 8 and verse 8. Nehemiah chapter 8 verse 8, it says, they read in the book of the law of God distinctly and gave the sense and caused them to understand the reading. What's happened is that people have returned from Babylon. Some of them aren't that familiar with the language of the Old Testament. And so they are reading out the law, they're reading nice and slowly and distinctly for those who aren't too good at the language, and then they're giving the sense, they're translating it. And these translations are still around, not probably Nehemiah's own one, but there are things like Targum Jonathan and Targum Onkelos and so on, which show every sign of being well before the time of Jesus, in a sort of oldish kind of Aramaic. Unfortunately, they are loose translations, they're not definite translations. That's one of them. It's a Hebrew script, but it's got one of the columns is the left-hand one, the right-hand one is the Hebrew Old Testament, and the translation into Aramaic is on the other side. The letters are the same, of course. That's, of course, a much, much later, that's an 11th century copy of it, but nonetheless it's an independent copy. It's been kept by people who didn't have much access. Well, that one they did, obviously, they've written the Hebrew text next to it, but for a long time it was written by people who didn't understand the Hebrew very well, so didn't correct it against the Hebrew. Unfortunately, it often breaks off into commentary. So you've got the translation, and in the middle it suddenly goes into commentary, and then back to the translation. Every now and again it will contain a Jewish folk story about the character who is involved. Always Jewish stories about things keep on cropping up. So it's a slightly odd kind of translation, but nonetheless it's a useful guide to the text and the meaning of the Old Testament. Now, the most significant translation, there it is in ancient times the Septuagint. The tradition tells us that the translation was made in the reign of Ptolemy II in Alexandria. That'd be about 250 BC. And that translation is supposed to have been done from a temple scroll by a committee of 70, sometimes the tradition says 72 scholars, and it's called the Septuagint because that means 70 in Latin. In reality, it's probably only the law that was translated in the first instance, but the other books were added quite quickly because by 150 AD we've actually got chunks of it in the Dead Sea Scrolls. So we know that it was a fairly early translation. And the Septuagint was copied by the Greek Orthodox Church. No offence to the Jews particularly. So again, you've got an independent set of copies. This particular one here is from the Codex Sinaiticus. So that one's about 330, 350 AD. And of course, this is, you're talking 500, 600 years after it was translated. It's quite a much later copy, but nonetheless it's an independent copy. That's the point, and we can compare that with the Hebrew text, and you find pretty well it's the same where it is. Now, the trouble is that the quality of the translation varies. The law is fairly precise and accurate translation, but some parts are quite loose in translation. Isaiah, for example, is a fairly loose translation. Jeremiah, there are two different translations, one of which fits the Hebrew very well. The other one is 20% shorter than the Masoretic text. I suspect some scholar decided to abridge Jeremiah because it takes a lot of reading through. It's a long one. If you've got a papyrus scroll, you can't get all of Jeremiah onto it. It won't take it. Daniel, now that's quite interesting because if you read the book of Daniel in a Roman Catholic Bible, you find there's extra bits to it. The story of Susanna and Bella the dragon and things like that. And I suspect what's gone on, this is out of the Septuagint, what's gone on is they've used the idea of the Targum, where you put Jewish folk stories in the middle of the translation every now and again. And that's why these extra bits of the book of Daniel that the Roman Catholics have come from. They're not, the people who translated them didn't think of them as part of the original text at all. The original text is what we have. But the Septuagint included that as well. And that's a nice answer to the problem of where it all comes from. But sometimes you get variation of the Septuagint text that text you can't just account for by loose translation. For example, if you go to the book of Exodus, chapter 1 and verse 5. Exodus chapter 1, verse 5 says, "All the souls that came out of the loins of Jacob were 70 souls, for Joseph was in Egypt already." And in Septuagint, it says 75 descendants. The Masoretic text has 70, the Septuagint has 75. Now, it's not a major, it doesn't exactly change one's belief in it's on the first principle, but nonetheless, it's actually a significant difference from the Masoretic text, and that one is a difficult one to solve. That's the only one I can't work out. If you use New Testament rules for comparing manuscripts, most of the variants come out, first of all, fairly minor, but they all come out fairly clear which is the correct one. In this case, it isn't clear which is the correct one. But back to it. So, if you look at the various the chronology of the various different sources, we've got a few more. We've got translations into Syriac, which is later Syrian Aramaic, most popular of which is called the Peshitta. Some of them was early as the 1st century AD, some of them was late as the 4th century. The early Latin version of the Bible had Old Testament made from the Greek Septuagint, so that doesn't really count, but the Vulgate was made from the Hebrew text of the time, so it gives us some check on the translation. And of course there's the New Testament itself, which quotes a lot from the Old Testament, and you can't use that as a test as to how well the Old Testament was copied, because the New Testament was copied by the Roman Catholics and by the Eastern Orthodox Church, not by the Jews. So we've got another independent witness. Now, the remaining source for the Old Testament is the Dead Sea Scrolls. And those are documents that were buried near the Dead Sea in antiquity, because that area is very dry, hardly ever rains at all. They survived where elsewhere in the ancient world things like paper would rot away. In the Dead Sea it's so dry that they're preserved. And there are all sorts of documents were buried, but among them the only ones I'm interested in tonight are scrolls of the Old Testament. And there are 4 places where you find these. Not just the ones as Qumran, the sort of traditional Dead Sea Scrolls there, but there were some also found at Masada. There were a few scrolls in a synagogue at the top, and when the Romans came, the synagogue was collapsed somehow, and they were preserved. There's also 2 other places. There's the Wadi Murabat and the Nahal Hever. There was a second revolt in 135 AD against Hadrian, which involved a lot of fighting around, and the remnants of that ended in up against the Dead Sea in these 2 valleys, and they buried some of their treasures, which were fairly minimal apart from biblical scrolls, which they also buried with them. And these had been discovered as well when they found the Dead Sea Scrolls at Qumran. The archaeologists then shot around and looked everywhere they could for more, and they found these 2, which come from about 135 AD. So there's some there. There's a table of how many we found of each one. The most common, popular one is Psalms. The prophets on the next page, wasn't space. There are 40 copies of Psalms. I haven't put in where the rest of them were found. There's 4 more between Masada, Nahal Hever and Wadi Murabat, but I'm somehow going to miss that off the column. So I think I might have missed a few off. The Laws are pretty popular. Deuteronomy is very popular indeed. Things like Chronicles, there's only one copy found, and that's very fragmentary, so we haven't got really much witness to the text of Chronicles. Song of Solomon, 4 copies, rather excitingly, but Esther, none. I suspect that they were a weird lot with the people at Qumran, and I think they had some theological problem with that, and so didn't copy it. But it doesn't mean that it isn't a perfectly good book of the Bible. I haven't found any copies of it. Prophets, Isaiah is very popular. Daniel, right, quite an interesting one, because that's quite an old one. I think I've got dates. These are the oldest of them. Daniel is one from 125 BC, and I have a copy of the Bible from the Dead Sea Scrolls written by some very critical critic, and he's amazed, he's absolutely flabbergasted by that, because he says everyone knows that Daniel couldn't have been written before 165 AD because of all the prophecies in it. And yet we've got 8 copies of Daniel in the Dead Sea Scrolls, some of them as early as 125 AD. That's only 40 years after it was written. How could it possibly have been believed it was scripture in such a short time? Well, the answer is you're all wrong about when it was written, of course. It had to be written earlier than that. You're quite right. It wouldn't, if it was an apocryphal book written 40 years earlier, then they would never have accepted it as part of the scriptures. It had to be written somewhere around the time it was supposed to be written. It's the only way to explain why it's there in the Dead Sea Scrolls. Now, even when you have got a biblical manuscript, sometimes it's in bits and you've only got part of it. And so actually there's only something like 20% of the Old Testament actually covered. Sorry, is that right? Sorry, Kings only has 10%. But sometimes you're talking about 50%, I think, of the text altogether. Just quick explanation. Each of the Dead Sea Scrolls has an identifier. The first bit says where it's from. Q means Qumran. 4Q is K4 at Qumran. That's what's in it. Jeremiah, and then A is the first copy they found. B is the second copy they found. C is the third copy out of that cave. That's how it goes. Now at this point it's a good idea to ask how good the text of the Dead Sea Scrolls actually is. It's very, very similar to the text we've got. There are only minor differences. If you're interested in the text, though, even minor differences need to be looked at. But the text actually is pretty well the same. On the plus side, we've got the antiquity of the scrolls. No one's touched them since 68 AD or 135, depending on which particular deposit of scrolls you've got. So we know they haven't been changed, if anything else was. And the fact that you can say which word in the Dead Sea Scrolls corresponds to which word in the current Hebrew text shows that it hasn't been changed by very much. But there are some problems that sometimes you get spelling differences. There's quite a lot of spelling differences, and it looks as though the Dead Sea Scrolls weren't that well copied. Sometimes it looks as though they were copied from dictation, where the scholar has been going along and then he's not able to keep up. Leaves a bit of a space and then carries on. Sometimes he puts in another word which sounds the same, so like there and there, 2 different spellings of it. You might put the wrong one in if you were taking dictation and going very fast. And of course the Dead Sea Scrolls scribes had a dispute with the temple authorities, so they weren't copying from a temple scroll, they were copying from some other scroll they managed to get hold of from elsewhere. So as a witness, it's not quite so good as the Masoretic text, and the dodgy scribes they were using, it's even less liable to be accurate. So on the whole, if there is a difference between the Dead Sea Scrolls and the Masoretic text is probably the better text. Not every time, but probably. There's an example there of poor copying. That's from one fragment of 4Q Jeremiah A. And what's happened is that the main copyist, who's copying this lot here, has got to a point, I can't reach it, so I'll try the pointer, got to a point here where he's missed out a chunk of the text. This is the end of Jeremiah 7 verse 30, and from Jeremiah 7 verse 30 to 8 verse 4 he hasn't copied it. Possibly the exemplar missed that, or maybe he was sort of dropping off while he was taking dictation and suddenly woke up and has missed some. He knew he'd missed some, so he left a gap, but it isn't anywhere near big enough and the correcting scribe, some of the scribes come up and tried to correct it, and he's found the gaps far too small, but he's not put him off, and he's done his best to fit it in. So he's written some, he's got a few lines there. So Jeremiah 7 verses 30 to 31, where he repeats the first words anyway again, is squashed into the gap. And then Jeremiah 37 verse 32 to 8 verse 3 is written sideways in the margin, and it still hasn't got enough space, so the last part of verse 3 is written upside down in the bottom margin. Something you never ever get away with an official Hebrew scroll. It just wouldn't happen like that. They were far too careful. They would have ripped out that sheet, or unstitched it, written it again, and stitched a new one in. And tough luck, it's expensive, so it's the scriptures, we're going to get it right. That's the attitude that the scribes for the official text took. So let's reach a temporary conclusion. I'm going to go on a little bit longer after this. What we can say is that all the evidence points to the fact that the modern Hebrew text is very, very accurate. And there isn't any sign, people think there's signs of development in the Dead Sea Scrolls. Well, there isn't. If you read it carefully, you'll find that the Dead Sea Scrolls, okay, there are spelling mistakes, and there are bits where careless scribes missed a little bit out, but there's very little case where there is any major difference. But the Masoretic text is not perfect. There are some places where it is wrong, and I'm going to show you a couple of them. I'm going to look at in Psalms. There are 40 manuscripts of Psalms, so they're particularly easy to copy, although these are probably their hymn books, which happen to have Psalms in them. So there are other things sometimes in them as well. And they preserve 126 of the 150 Psalms. And there are only 3 significant variants in the whole lot. Most of them, there are lots of insignificant, where they've spelt something wrong, or they smudged a word or something like that. But let's look at one of them. Psalm 22 and verse 16. And I think this is a well-known problem. Psalm 22, it's the crucifixion psalm. Verse 16, and we have in the authorized version, for dogs have compassed me, the assembly of the wicked has enclosed me, they pierced my hands and my feet. Right? Now, if you have a Masoretic text, if you have, I think, the Tanakh translation that goes from that, with Jewish translator, you'll get, like a lion, my hands and my feet. Right? What we have is from the Septuagint. Now, the Masoretic tense doesn't make sense. It's almost certainly wrong. You'd expect at least to be a grammatical sentence or something made sense. Well, it doesn't in this case. It's unlikely as a reflection of a psalm, a poem written by David. Not only that, they had a reason to alter the text. It's very obviously a reference to Jesus. All the old versions all have, they pierced my hands and my feet. So all these translations all have, they pierced my hands and my feet, all the ones from the Hebrew. That's why the authorized version, translated long before the Dead Sea Scrolls were discovered, has, they pierced my hands and my feet, because all the other witnesses have that. The nice thing is, there's only one copy of this psalm in the Dead Sea Scrolls from the Nahal Haver, the only psalm scroll from the Nahal Haver, and that reads, they pierced my hands and my feet. So in 135 AD, that's what the official Hebrew text said. So we've got confirmation that something that everyone believed was a mistake in the Masoretic text, and knew the correct text. The correct text that we've got in the authorized version is the correct text. The other example is Psalm 145, and this one, the authorized version, I think is wrong. It doesn't make a lot of difference, mind, but I think it is. Psalm 145 and verse 13, really. I'm not going to read it out, because the bit I want to read out isn't there. If you look at Psalm 145, it's got 21 verses. There are 22 letters in the Hebrew alphabet, and each verse begins with a different letter of the Hebrew alphabet, except the one for nun, N, as it were, is missing. It appears in the Septuagint, although you can't tell what letter it began with there, it's in translation. But in the Cave 11 Psalm scroll, there it is up there, it's in there, and it reads, God is faithful in his words and gracious in his deeds. Doesn't make a lot of difference to my faith, but nonetheless, probably that should be there, making the 22nd verse, as it were, of this psalm. We're talking about one of the most major variations here in the Old Testament text. It's important not to get the thing mixed up and think, well, there's all these variants. There are, but they're things like spelling mistakes. That's one of the most significant ones around. I've already done the most significant one, which is they pierced my hands and my feet. That's the most significant variation there is. Now, my main source on the Dead Sea Scroll actually lists hundreds of these variants, but essentially they amount to spelling mistakes by scribes, obvious ones. But there are 71 places it picks out as being significant variants, and I've made a list of those up there. Let's see what they are. What I've done is they use a special method of dealing with the Old Testament, which no New Testament scholar would laugh at, to say these are all significant variations. What a New Testament scholar does is they say, well, which text is correct, and how confident are we in the variant we've picked? So A means there's absolutely no doubt whatsoever which is the correct original text. So of the 71, 42 are A, and it's absolutely clear what the original text was. When it says they're significant, they're not necessarily, this might be one word that's different, and it might be something like the psalm we've read, where the word doesn't tell us anything different about the text. B means we're practically certain, but there's a little bit of possibility of doubt. C means that we can make a fairly good guess, but there might be some more difficulty. And D means we're not really certain. There are 5 places where we're not really certain. There are, actually I re-evaluated that and I've put a 13 and an 11, 13 being 11C. Most of them, it's the Masoretic text that's correct. Obviously for D I've put 0 because we don't know which text it is. I can't indicate where it goes in the column. Then classified them by importance. So the one with 1 star is really not, it's a word missing or something like that. They've put it down as important, but things like the city in Egypt, was it surrounded by rivers or was it surrounded by the sea? It's not a major difference. 2 stars is several words missing typically. It's usually the Dead Sea Scrolls have made the mistake. Just occasionally you can see that it makes more sense to put it in. The 3-star ones are ones where it actually makes a difference to the meaning of the text. There are only 6 of those in the whole of the Old Testament. We've dealt with 2 of them already, the most significant of them. I haven't really got time to deal with the rest, but there's the list. Actually, we dealt with 3 of them, mentioned 3 of them. So the number of descendants of Jacob, it's fairly clear which one it is, but that's not particularly hard. How many years were they in Egypt? There were 400 years in captivity. Was it 400 years in Egypt, 430 years in Egypt, or 430 years in Egypt and in Canaan? And that one's a difficult one because not even the Masoretic text agrees on that one. Deuteronomy 34 verse 6, who buried Moses? Was Moses buried by God or by the children of Israel? Well, it's fairly obvious he was buried by God because the children of Israel didn't know where he was buried. If they did it themselves, they would have known. So that's an A. It's clear which one it is. Masoretic text is correct. Joshua 8 verse 30, it describes Joshua building an altar on Mount Gerizim. But in one of the Dead Sea Scrolls, we have that earlier. So he crosses the Jordan and immediately builds an altar. And maybe that's correct, but it's a question of where that text comes rather than whether that text should be there. That's going to be. There's Judges 6 verse 7 to 10. There's some witnesses ignore. There's a bit where it talks about them crying for help and God helping them and sending them a judge and them they're delivering them from their enemies and then them waxing evil again, wicked again, and turning away from God and then being delivered into another head of enemies. It's a quick summary of it. Almost certainly that's there, it's just a gap that's missing. It's all the witnesses apart from some of the Dead Sea Scrolls. And they pierced my hands and my feet, we've dealt with, and again it's clear where it's going. So that's your entire significant set of variations in the Old Testament. There they all are. There's nothing else. So really, conclusion you can come with, we can say there are lots of independent witnesses, not just there's one Hebrew witness to the text of the Old Testament. There are lots of witnesses. Dead Sea Scrolls is only one. They all witness the same text. You can put the same chapter and verse on every one. You can actually identify individual words and say that word correctly spelt. That good. When you get variants, they're very, very minor variants. And even those 6 major variants don't make any difference to what you need to believe.